Well, the day has finally arrived. Keychron has finally unveiled their long-awaited flagship mouse, the G1. Now, this mouse was released under the Lemokey branding, and if you're not familiar with that branding, I don't blame you, as they just kind of popped out of nowhere. It turns out that Lemokey is actually a subsidiary of Keychron, responsible for releasing their more gaming-focused products, such as gaming keyboards and gaming mice, like the G1. Now, Keychron have been releasing mice for quite a while now, and I've talked about many of their past models here on the channel before, the Keychron M2 being my personal favorite of all of their mice. Generally speaking, Keychron mice have always been fantastic budget options with great performance, but every single Keychron mouse has always had some kind of shortfall. There has always been some aspect of the mouse that is just not really executed that well. Here on the G1, we see a similar trend where the on-paper specs are very impressive, as this is the first Keychron mouse to support 8K polling, and it is also utilizing the brand new Pixart 3950 sensor. So while the G1 looks promising, the success or failure of this mouse is going to heavily depend on whether Keychron has learned from its previous mistakes on their previous models, and if they are able to implement proper fixes to those things and deliver a true flagship experience here on the Lemokey G1. But we're going to talk all about that and so much more here in this episode of the mel0n review. But before we do so, I did want to say a big thank you to Keychron/Lemokey, who was kind enough to send over the G1 for review. Alright, well, let's go ahead and dive right into the nitty gritty of the Lemokey G1. Alright, let's talk about the G1's in-game performance first. As per all the previous Keychron mice, they've always had fantastic performance, and their sensor implementations and high pollinger implementations have always been stellar, significantly better than you'd expect on a mouse of this price point. But as I mentioned earlier, there has always been some form of misexecution in terms of the shape of the mouse or the overall feeling of the mouse. The same story goes here on the G1, where the mouse on a performance standpoint is one of the better performing mice I've tested this year. The G1 shape and the overall feel of the mouse in terms of its quality and click quality pales in comparison to the stellar performance on this mouse. Now, this isn't to say that the G1 is a bad mouse. This is without a doubt the best mouse that Keychron has released, and there have been a lot of improvements over the previous Keychron mice. The 8K polling implementation via the wireless and wire connectivity is perfectly implemented. The coding has also improved quite a bit, but it's disappointing to see a lot of the same mistakes that were on the previous Keychron mice here on the G1, especially considering that this is Keychron/Lemokey's first flagship mouse. Now, I'll talk more about the shortfalls of the G1 later in this video, but overall the G1 still did perform exceptionally well. Just keep in mind, if you're going to get this mouse, you're going to be getting the average Keychron experience, where the performance is stellar, but the mouse itself just feels a little underwhelming. Now, in terms of pricing and available versions for the G1, there are two available versions, one with the Pixart 3395 and one with the Pixart 3950. The 3395 version retails for 94 Canadian dollars, and the 3950 version retails for 99 Canadian dollars. Both versions of the G1 are the same in terms of their dimensions, shape, and the internal specifications. The only difference between them is that one is using the 3395 and one is using the 3950. Both versions are available in both white and black. Today we're going to be talking about the G1 with the 3950 sensor in the black colorway. Now, in terms of the unboxing experience here for the G1, the overall experience is pretty similar to the previous Keychron mice. We have the same rectangular packaging we saw for the Keychron M3 Mini 4K and the M2. Inside the box we have the G1 itself. We also have a USB-C to C cable that is metal plated on both ends, and it is unfortunately non-tilted. We have a USB-A to C adapter and a USB-C to A adapter that is also metal plated. Sadly, the USB-C to A adapter does not have any rubber on the bottom of it, so it just slides across your desk very easily, which is unfortunate to see for a flagship mouse. There is also a USB 2.4 GHz wireless receiver that is stored inside the G1 itself in this little compartment on the bottom of the mouse. We also have a full user manual, which is nice to see included here with the G1. There are no other included accessories with the G1, so no extra stock skates and no grip tape of any kind included, which is a bit of a miss for a more flagship mouse. Overall, the unboxing experience is pretty average for a Keychron mouse. It is a little lacking in terms of accessories such as an extra set of stock skates or included grip tape, like you'd see on other brands' more flagship mice, but for a Keychron mouse, this is pretty par for the course in terms of the unboxing experience. Alright, let's talk about the G1's build quality and QC next. The build quality here on the G1 is actually quite good. The whole shell is quite rigid, there's no creaking or flexing anywhere on the unit, and the base of the G1 is also quite rigid as well, which is great to see. In terms of QC here on the G1, all the buttons on the mouse feel pretty consistent. The G1's main clicks do rattle a little bit if you shake the mouse. We have seen this on previous Keychron mice, and I will admit I'm a little surprised to see this on a more flagship mouse like the G1, but this is a purely cosmetic issue, I guess you could could say, and it doesn't affect the usage of the main clicks at all. Aside from the rattling of the main clicks, the rest of the QC here on the G1 is quite good. It's on par with the QC you've seen on all the previous Keychron mice. Alright, let's talk about weight next. Now, Lemokey is advertising that the G1 is going to be weighing in at 55 plus minus 3 grams. Weighing in my G1 with the stock skates installed, my unit is coming in at a surprising 54.44 grams. Previously released Keychron mice have always been a little over the advertised weight spec, but here on the G1 it's actually coming in well under the advertised weight spec, which is great to see. But despite this mouse being under the weight spec, I am still going to criticize Keychron here a little bit. The included USB-A storage in the bottom of the mouse doesn't make a lot of sense for a more gaming focused flagship mouse, and this feature wasn't on any of other Keychron's previous mice, so I'm a little confused on why this is included on a flagship mouse. For this being a flagship mouse, I expected something new and bold from Keychron, but having the G1 coming in around the same weight as previous Keychron mice is a little disappointing to say the least, and the questionable design decisions don't help its case. But despite the odd design decisions here for the G1, the weight of 54.44 grams is good here for the G1, but there is definitely a lot of room for improvement here. Alright, let's talk about the G1 stock skates next. The G1 is using the same black dyed PTFE skates we've seen on previous Keychron mice, but the shape of the skates here on the G1 are strange to say the least. The G1's top skate is this thin half oval like shape, but the base skate is this weird half circular blocky like shape. I've never seen a skate design like this, and the performance is very lackluster. The top one is fine, but the bottom one is so high friction, the mouse feels very bottom heavy and unbalanced in the hand during use. I ended up removing the stocks and installing the ESP Tiger Yanzi dots and a couple other dots over testing, as those dot skates felt significantly better than the stock skates did. Another strange design decision here in the G1 is that there are no skate removal ramps at the bottom of the mouse. All the previous Keychron mice had skate removal ramps, but the G1 not having them is a big issue for two big reasons. Number one, because the stock skates are so poor, you're going to want to remove them no matter what, but removing the stock skates without a skate ramp is very difficult, and the bottom of the G1 shell is extremely thin plastic, so it's very easy for you to put a hole or dent or warp the base of the G1 shell because there's no skate removal ramps when you go to remove the stock skates. This is another big miss here for Keychron and Lemokey, as I don't know why they didn't put skate removal ramps on the bottom of this mouse, especially considering the size of these skates. In terms of the skates performance, similar to what we've seen with all the previous Keychron mice, the stock skates are very work office optimized, and the same thing goes here in the G1, where the skates are just very work office optimized and are not optimized for gaming use at all, especially considering the top and bottom skates are so unbalanced in terms of their friction. They just feels really bad overall. This is another area where I'm kind of left to question why Lemokey put these skates on this mouse. For this being a flagship gaming mouse, these skates are very counterintuitive to the nature of this mouse and should be a completely different shape, or like half or quarter the size of the ones that are currently on here. Alright, let's talk connectivity next. The G1, just like all of the previous Keychron mice, is a tri-connectivity mouse, usable via Bluetooth, 2.4 GHz, and wired USB-C. All the connectivity methods worked perfectly here on the G1 with no issues from my testing. Just keep in mind that if you do utilize Bluetooth, it will cap your report rate to 125 Hz, while on wired USB-C and 2.4 GHz, you can utilize 125 Hz to 8000 Hz. Alright, now before we move on, I also wanted to talk about the G1 stock cable. Now, as I talked about in my unboxing section, the G1 comes with a paracord wrapped USB-C to C cable with metal-ended USB-C sides. The cable itself is a little on the thicker side, but it is thin enough where it will still be compatible with bungees. The paracord wrapping is slightly rough, but not so much that it will hook onto more controlled mousepad surfaces, causing unnecessary friction. However, one major missed opportunity here with the stock cable is that one of the USB-C ends isn't tilted. Thankfully, as I mentioned before, the cable is compatible with bungee, so this isn't a massive issue, but wired use is a little odd as the USB-C end is non-tilted, and as I mentioned earlier, the USB-C end is also metal, so it also adds a lot of extra weight to the front half of the G1 during use that is noticeable during usage. For a flagship mouse like this that does have AK pulling over the wireless connection, one of the USB-C ends of the cable should be flat and metal, and the other one should be plastic and should be tilted at like a 45-degree angle like the X2H and X2V2 cables. A cable like this would make wired usage here on the G1 significantly better, as the current implementation isn't ideal. At least it's usable with bungees, but the extra weight is a bit of a deal breaker here because it does make the G1 feel even more unbalanced than it already is. Alright, let's talk about the G1 shape next. Now, this is quite a unique shape. The shape is a right-handed asymmetrical mouse. The mouse can be technically used as an ambi mouse because it is a very slight asymmetrical shape, but left-handed users won't have access to side buttons. The G1 shell is measuring it at 116.8 by 59.5 by 39.4 millimeters. The shell is made out of ABS plastic similar to that of the previous Keychron mice. From the top down, the G1 shell profile is kind of similar to that of the M3 Mini 4K, just with a much less rounded rear hump. Looking at the G1 from the bottom, you can see that the slight hourglass curvature on the G1 shell isn't fully symmetrical, as it is very slightly asymmetrical, as the right side of the shell, left if you're looking from the bottom, has a much deeper hourglass-like curvature to it, while the left side, right from the bottom, is largely flat. From the side, we can see that the G1's hump profile terminates roughly at the midpoint of the mouse, and from the rear, we can see that the shell curvature of the G1 is more of that egg-like tall hump we've seen on mice like the Sprime PM1. From the front, we can see that the G1 sides are slightly inwardly tilted, but they're largely flat, so it's easy to anchor your fingers against the side of the G1 shell. Using the G1 with my hand size, the G1 feels like a symmetrical shell. You don't even really notice the slight asymmetrical feel to it unless you're actually looking for it, as it is very, very slight. Overall, the G1 shell is pretty well executed. It is a very unique, very slight asymmetrical shape that works best for smaller to medium-sized hands. For larger hands like myself, it's going to feel like a pure symmetrical mouse pretty much no matter what. Now, in terms of grip compatibility and hand size compatibility, since the G1 is a smaller mouse with a very unique shape, the G1 is going to be a little different than other smaller asim or symmetrical mice we've covered here on the channel before in terms of its compatibility with different hands and grip styles. For my 19.5 by 12.7 hands, the G1 is a little on the small side for my hand size, so I did end up primarily testing this mouse with fingertip grip, which did work decently well, but the G1's slight asymmetrical shape didn't make fingertip grip that easy, and also the weight of the mouse wasn't ideal for fingertip usage, but it was still passable, at least from my use case. In terms of compatible grip styles and hand sizes here for the G1, for small hands this is going to be a palm or claw mouse. For small to medium hands, palm and claw again. For medium-sized hands, claw and fingertip. For large hands, a fingertip or a very, very aggressive aggro claw grip, but this will depend on your hand size. As I mentioned earlier, due to the weight of the G1 and the very slight asymmetrical shape, it's not the most ideal fingertip mouse. It's not going to be like the Sora V2, where it was a very light mouse with a purely symmetrical shape that was a lot more compatible for fingertip grip. Here on the G1, it's not going to be as compatible, so this mouse is going to be primarily best suited for small to medium-sized hands. Bigger-handed people like myself can use this mouse with a fingertip grip, but its usage isn't going to be as optimized as it will be for small and medium-sized hands. Alright, let's talk about the G1's coding next. Now, coding is one area where Keychron has always struggled with, as their coatings have always been very work optimized, where they basically don't have a lot of grip to them. They're like a fine grit coating that worked really well for just like general use and office use, but they always fell short in terms of gaming performance, because once your hands got a little bit of sweaty, the mouse would basically turn into an ice cube. Now, Keychron has addressed this to an extent here on the G1, where instead of using the very fine grit coating we saw in the previous Keychron mice, they're using a much grittier or more wrinkly coating here on the G1, which does massively improve the gripability of the shell, but it's still not perfect. The coating still does get very slippery when your hands get very sweaty. It is an improvement, but it's still not the improvement I was expecting here, which is disappointing. And for a flagship mouse, the coating pales in comparison to other flagship mouses' coatings. Another thing that is disappointing that I've wanted Keychron to do for a very long time to address is to include grip tape, but they are not including any grip tape here with the G1, which is a big miss in my opinion, as the coating is still very lackluster. If you're going to get this mouse, and especially if you're going to use fingertip grip on this mouse, I would highly recommend getting some form of aftermarket grips like the X-Ray Pad Geckos 2.0 or Cicada Wings 2.0, as the coating is very poor in terms of its performance across the board. Alright, let's talk about the G1's main clicks next. The shell buttons are these slightly tilted, largely flat main clicks. The main clicks are using the same coating as the rest of the G1 shell. I'll give you a quick little sound test of the main buttons here for you. Inside, the G1 is using the Wano blue shell pink dot switches as we've seen on the previous Keychron mice. In terms of the main click actuation weight, the main buttons are about a 6 out of 10, similar to the actuation weight we've seen on Keychron's previous mice. The main clicks do have a lot of pre-travel and a fair amount of post-travel. The main clicks have a strong rebound that does help counteract that longer pre and post-travel and keeps the main clicks fairly spammable. The main click actuation is consistent across the entire shell clicks, which is great to see, and the main clicks are decently well stabilized and they don't wobble during use. As with most mice that are using the Wano blue shell pink dot buttons, the default debounce for this mouse is going to be set to 8 ms out of the box, so if you're going to get the G1, I'd recommend adjusting that down to 2 or 1 before you use the mouse for gaming. Now, while the main clicks on the G1 feel okay, there is one critical flaw with them that has been on every single previous Keychron mice that I'm very disappointed to see here on the G1, and that is that the main clicks are not indented. Now, this has been something I have been yapping about with Keychron mice for a very long time. It has been the biggest shortfall of all of their previous mice, and for some reason it's exactly the same situation here. Now, to Keychron's credit, they did make the side of the main buttons a little thinner, so it's not as easy to prevent actuation, but with this mouse's size and because the main clicks are not indented into the shell, there were multiple situations when I'd be using the mouse and my thumb would actually prevent actuation of the main click, which was incredibly frustrating. For a flagship mouse, the clicks not being indented like this is just, to be completely frank, unacceptable, because it is a massive issue in terms of hand compatibility. For anyone with a larger thumb like myself and you're using a palm or claw grip here on the G1, you will prevent actuation of the main clicks quite a few times during use, which is just really frustrating to see. Again, as I mentioned before, this has been an issue on every single Keychron mouse that they have ever released. Even their fingertip mouse doesn't have indented clicks, which just blows my mind. And we have the same situation here on the G1, and it's just very disappointing to see this on a flagship mouse, as it massively hampers the usability of this mouse. But overall, aside from the indentation, the main clicks do feel pretty good. Again, Keychron mice have always had pretty good main clicks in terms of their feel. The biggest issue with them has always been that they're not indented into the shell, and we have the exact same issue here on the G1. All right, let's talk about the G1 side buttons next. Now, the side buttons here are a little unique, as they're quite a unique shape for a side button. They're kind of these like raised platforms with like this kind of flat edge to them. They're a little odd. The top of the side clicks is using the same coating as the rest of the G1 shell, but the sides are just like a glossy plastics. They do feel a little weird to the hand. I much would have preferred seeing like the older style of the Keychron side buttons here, but it is what it is. The side buttons do protrude from the G1 shell enough to make them consistent for actuation even with the back side button, and they are positioned slightly forward to the midline of the G1 shell, and they are ever so slightly forwardly tilted. I'll give you a quick little sound test of the side buttons here. Now, the side buttons here for the G1 are Wano white dot switches. The side buttons have a ludicrous amount of pre-travel and a fair amount of post-travel as well. The switch itself does have a good rebound, as I've used it before, but the rebound gets completely nullified by the insane amount of pre-travel. The stabilization to the side buttons is also very poor and the buttons feel very loose. Overall, the side buttons just feel really bad. They're easily the worst side buttons I've used this year. Somehow they're worse than the original Stormbreaker side buttons, and they are much worse than the previous side button implementations we've seen on previous Keychron mice. Again, this is another area where I'm left wondering why Keychron designed it in this way. It just feels like it's taken 10 steps back from the original side button implementation on other mice like the Keychron M2, which was very, very well implemented. All right, let's talk about the G1 scroll wheel next. The scroll wheel texturing is slightly different from that tri-tip screwdriver like texturing we saw on the Keychron M2 and Keychron's other older mice, where here on the G1, the scroll wheel texturing is a linear line like texturing, similar to the texturing we found on the Helios 2 Pro S's scroll wheel. Inside, the G1 is using an F-Switch 11S encoder, the same F-Switch branding we've seen on many of the other Keychron mice's previous encoders. The scroll wheel is fairly light. I'd probably say around a 4 out of 10 in terms of actuation force. The encoder has very slightly pronounced scroll points, so much so where it's very easy to accidentally actuate the scroll wheel and trying to do a scroll wheel click, a similar issue we found on the Vancer Groove, and an issue that heavily hampers these scroll wheels used for gaming situations like a flagship mouse would be used for. In terms of the scroll wheel click, the G1 is using a very unique switch I've never seen before. Thank you to the Whale on Twitter and a bunch of other people who helped me kind of figure out what this is. I believe this is a TTC switch, but this is called a level 3 switch where it's raised where the actual click plunger is. Again, if it's TTC or not, I'm not 100% sure because the branding on it's a little weird, but it is a level 3 switch of some variety, very different from the common box switch or pillar switch we commonly see for scroll wheel clicks. The scroll wheel clicks actuation is probably around a 5 out of 10, similar to the main clicks and these side buttons. As per usual for a scroll wheel click, the click is pretty mushy, and considering this is a taller switch, this checks out for how it's going to feel. Scroll wheel clicks almost always feel pretty bad. Overall, the scroll wheel implementation here on the G1 is okay. My biggest issue is that the encoder is too light and it's too easy to misactuate the scroll wheel when trying to do a click. Just like the G1 side buttons, this is another area where Keychron has gone backwards. Comparing the G1 scroll wheel to the M2 scroll wheel, it's like a night and day difference, but the M2 came out way before the G1 did, so just another confusingly implemented aspect of this mouse that just doesn't really make a lot of sense, and the actual feeling of it is just really bad. All right, let's talk about sensor and MCU next, as this is one area where there have been a lot of improvements over the previous Keychron mice. As I mentioned earlier, the G1 comes in two versions, one with a 3395 and one with a 3950, and both are using a new MCU, the Realitech 8762G, which I have not seen used in a mouse before. Now, the 33950 sensor here is centrally positioned in the G1 shell. It is an unlocked sensor with a max DPI of 30K. It has an IPS of 750 and 3 LOD levels, 0.7mm, 1mm, and 2 2mm. The 3950 also has ripple, angle snapping, and motion sync available on the sensor, and these features can be enabled or disabled via the G1's web-based software, which we will talk about later in this video. Now, I'll talk about the high polling rate implementation in a moment, but from my testing, the sensor and MCU implementation here on the G1 is very solid. Despite this being a newer, unknown MCU that I haven't used before, it actually does work very well here on the G1. The only real downside to this new MCU is some battery optimization issues, but I'll talk about that a little later. Alright, let's talk about the high polling rate implementation next. As I mentioned earlier, Keychron mice always have really good high polling rate implementations and just really good overall performance, and here on the G1 that is the same story. Now, the G1 can utilize 125Hz to 8K over both wireless and wired connectivity, which is great to see. This is new to Keychron mice, as the previous M3 Mini 4K and the other 4K versions of their previous models did not have 4K or 2K polling over the wireless connection. Now, from my testing, the 1 to 4K polling over the wireless and wired connectivity was perfectly implemented. I had no issues over any of my testing on, regardless of the surface I was testing on. It all worked perfectly fine. I had no problems. The only polling rate I had issues with was 8K, but that's not due to Keychron's polling implementation. That's just because my system's a little older and it doesn't play too well with 8K polling. So while unfortunately I can't really speak to the 8K polling performance here on the G1, the 1 to 4K polling performance over the wired and wireless connectivity was perfectly implemented, and I had no issues at all during my testing. Alright, let's talk about the G1's battery next, as this is one area where I'm left a little dumbfounded at Keychron's and Lemokey's execution here, and there's some uniqueness here because of the new Realtek MCU. Here on the G1, it is using a 600 mAh battery, just like a lot of the other previous Keychron mice have. Now, Keychron is advertising that on the G1 on 1K polling, it's supposed to get 120 hours, 140 hours on Bluetooth, 45 hours on 4K, 40 hours on 8K, and they don't have any mentioning of battery life on 2K. Now, for a 600 mAh battery, these battery levels are very underwhelming, as there are mice with 250 mAh batteries that have similar battery life but being significantly smaller. Now, from my personal testing, the overall battery life here on the G1 was somehow even worse than the advertised battery life. On 1K polling, my unit only lasts 66 hours. On 2K, it was 40 hours. On 4K, it was 27 hours. And on 8K, it was only 12 hours. For a 600 mAh battery, I'm kind of astounded at how bad the battery is here. If the G1 had a 250 mAh battery, these numbers would be a little more passable, but for a 600 mAh battery, this is just unacceptable. I do have a couple theories as to why this is. Previous Keychron mice have had really good battery life, but they have been using Nordic or Telelink MCUs, and then here on the G1 we have this Realtek 8762G MCU. So I'm not sure if the MCU is at fault for the poor battery optimizations here, because again, it should be way better than it is. There are Keychron mice that have released in the past with smaller batteries that have better performance than this with a Nordic MCU, so I'm not sure if this is just poor power optimization or if this is the MCU's fault, but regardless of what the reasoning is, the battery life here on the G1 is abysmal. One of the worst battery implementations of battery optimized mice I've covered this year. Now, another really concerning aspect about the battery here is that the way the battery is installed in this unit is that it is literally just taped to the top of the sensor and the main board via some adhesive pads, and these adhesive pads come off very easily. So if you're a little more rough with your mouse, or if you drop your mouse, there is a very good chance this battery is going to come loose, because it's literally just kind of glued onto the top of the main board, which is very concerning. Now, this sketchy battery anchoring does actually have a little bit of a benefit, because it does make it extremely easy to mod out the battery for a smaller one, but in doing so, you're going to nuke your battery life even further, because again, it's just so poorly optimized. It's going to be even worse on like a 250 mAh battery or a 300 mAh battery. So overall, the battery life here on the G1 is just really surprisingly bad. I had much higher expectations based off my previous experience with Keychron's other mice. I have a feeling this is at fault of just poor battery optimization, or it's this new Realtek MCU. I'm not sure exactly who's at fault, but this is one area that Keychron needs to do a lot of optimizations on, as the battery life here on the G1 is completely unacceptable for a flagship mouse. Alrighty, let's talk about the G1 software next. Now, this is one area where Keychron has made some massive improvements over their previous software implementation. Now, the G1 is utilizing Keychron's new web-based software, which is great to see. Now, since this is a web-based software, unfortunately it does only work on Chromium-based browsers, so it's only going to work on Chrome and Microsoft Edge currently. Now, the software itself is pretty straightforward. It has all the features you'd expect from mouse software. By default, the G1 is set to 1600 DPI, ripple and motion sync are set to on by default, and as I mentioned earlier, the click debounce is set to 8 ms by default. You'll want to adjust that before you use this mouse for gaming. There are still no auto sleep options, just like all the previous Keychron mice. On wireless and Bluetooth, the mouse will go to sleep sleep every 10 minutes or so. When the mouse is running wired connection, the auto sleep is disabled. I would like Keychron to add options to adjust or disable the auto sleep, but this is a very minimal issue. One thing though I am very happy to see here with the web-based software is that the firmware updates for the G1 are now locally available. On previous Keychron mice, you had to download the firmware and manually flash it, which could be a little bit of an iffy process and had a pretty high failure rate on some versions of this mouse. So having everything in the web-based software is really nice to see, and it's very easy to update the mouse itself or the firmware. So if Keychron does end up releasing any kind of feature patches to patch the battery life or improve the battery optimizations, it'll be very easy to apply those, which is great to see. Overall, the web-based software here for the G1 is awesome, a huge step up from the previous software implementation that Keychron used on their older mice, and I'm very, very happy to see this web-based software here, and it works extremely well. All right, let's talk about repairability next. Keychron mice historically have been pretty serviceable, but the same does not go here for the G1. The top shell and the base shell are held together by a clip, similar to what we saw in the Vancer Groove and the Vancer Thrash, but here on the G1, because the base is so thin, whenever you stick a screwdriver into the shell to try to release this clip, you pretty much break the base almost immediately and causes a big dent in the bottom, which is a big issue and very disappointing to say the least. The battery install, as I mentioned earlier, is also very sus. It's just taped on top of the main board. I would have much rather seen them get rid of this useless USB-A dongle storage in this mouse and actually proper anchor the battery back there, but it is what it is. That's what they've done for this mouse. That's their decision making. It is what it is. I just don't like the idea of a battery just being loosely taped on top of a sensor. That just raises a lot of red flags for me in terms of long-term durability. But the rest of the G1 is fairly easy to service overall and pretty easy to service, but it is significantly less serviceable than the previous Keychron mice, which is very disappointing to see. Yet another area where Keychron has taken a lot of steps back in the design of their product. All right, well, in closing, the Lemokey G1 is overall a heartbreakingly disappointing mouse. I had such high hopes for this mouse, that this was supposed to be Keychron's like mainstream mouse, but this mouse is just horribly implemented. To their credit, they have made some improvements in terms of the software and some other aspects of this mouse, but they also repeated a lot of the same mistakes they made on their previous mice, as well as some new mistakes that just don't make any sense. If the unit had a better coating, indented main clicks, better shaped side buttons, a lower weight, better skates, a non-included USB-A dongle storage at the bottom of the mouse, which makes zero sense, and much better battery optimizations, the G1 would be a flagship worthy mouse, but in its current iteration, the G1 just feels like a half-baked mess of a flagship mouse that I cannot recommend under any circumstances. For the $99 Canadian price tag, you are much better off investing a couple extra bucks and getting a mouse like the Sora V2, the Pulsar X2 V2 Mini, or the X2H Mini, or the Endgame Gear OP1AK, as those mice are much more well-rounded and don't suffer from the poor design decisions and the just misexecutional issues that the G1 does. Alright, well that's going to be everything for this episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much for watching my review of the Lemokey G1. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you again to Keychron, who was kind enough to send over the G1 for review. I greatly appreciate that. Thank you very much again to our channel members, UKI89, Prince, It Was Luck, and Lunaris. Thank you very much for your support. If you'd like to become a member and directly help support the channel, you can become a member here on YouTube for $2 Canadian. It is the best way to directly support the channel, so thank you very much for your support. You can also help support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Mekkeys, Potent Gaming, and TJ Exclusives, as well as a couple other retailers to help save yourself a couple dollars off your orders. But that's everything for today. Thank you very much for watching my review of the Lemokey G1, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.